Good morning. Today's April 6th, and it's Monday. I want to quickly go over your objective for the day, and it's I will complete an outline to demonstrate my comprehension of the abolitionist movement. Remember, you started Chapter 15, Section 2, and did an outline on Friday, but I had to only do half of it. Today, you're going to complete it. I have put the template up, so you can use my template or make your own. It's up to you. And I just want to go over what you should have read last week and what you're going to read today. So last week you were learning at the beginning of the abolitionist movement. And basically it was talking about how the issue with slavery started even before we declared independence. In the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson actually eliminated slavery when we became a country. But remember, the original didn't go through, and during the debates and the discussion and making changes, the South said, hey, if you take out slavery, we'll never agree to declaring independence. We'll just stay part of England, because England allows us to have slaves. So we left it in. From then, we always had groups that were anti-slavery. But quite frankly, most Americans didn't care if there was slavery or wanted slavery. The people who tended to want to ban slavery were rich white women. It came out of the Second Great Awakening and religion. And this group, they were mostly women because they had time. They were rich. They had servants. They had nannies. They had time to go and do the temperance movement. They had time to do the women's rights movement. They had time to do abolitionist movement. The average person living up north either didn't care or didn't want slaves to be freed, because if you're a worker, most of them were recent immigrants. They were living in a one-bedroom type apartment with like 10 or 12 people, and they were getting very low wages. If the slaves were released and were free, many of them would leave the South, of course, because they had such horrible experiences there, and would go up north. If they go up north, the workers are afraid they're going to start taking their jobs. Now remember, slaves have never been paid in their lives. And these immigrants are already, and these recent people and the poor workers up north, they aren't getting paid very much. But if the slaves have never been paid ever, they're afraid we're going to come up and take their jobs and be willing to work for half of what they're making. So if you can get a slave that works for 50 cents an hour, or pay the other people that you're already paying $1 an hour as a capitalist in America, most of them would be like, oh, no problem, we'll pay 50 cents, which would drive down the wages even further than they already were. The first abolitionist that you learn about is William Lloyd Garrison. He definitely was one of the biggest people in the abolitionist movement. He wrote, he spoke, he had his own newspaper, he published. The next people you learned about were the Grimke sisters, who were kind of my favorites in this movement, only because it was so different for them. They really went out on a limb. They were Southerners, born and raised on a plantation, very wealthy white women, and they ended up moving up north and joined the abolitionist movement. And they wrote and spoke out against slavery. When their parents died and they were getting their inheritance, they said, don't give us money, just give us slaves. So they were given slaves, which they released upon the receiving of them. The next group we talked about is the United States Colonization Society, which is quite interesting. They took in donations, and people would give them money, and they would go around and free individual slaves. Now, that sounds great, but can you picture a GoFundMe for getting money for slaves? That's kind of what it was. So here are this colonization society. They would go and buy a slave at a time as they got money. So if you're a family, husband, wife, and 3 kids, they would only buy one of you. And then it wasn't like they just bought your freedom and you went and lived someplace up north. No, their idea was, hey, we're going to send them back to Africa. So between paying and other ways, they end up with this land in Africa, and they called it Liberia, like liberty. And they were sending the freed slaves over to Liberia. Now, the slaves were very happy about being freed, but most of them had no thrill. They were not thrilled about going over to Liberia. First of all, they were born and raised here. Many of these slaves had ancestors that went back 100, 200 years. They don't know the cultures in Africa. They don't know how to speak any of the languages. They only speak English. Why would they want to go to Africa? So that didn't go over really well. They ended up sending about 10,000 freed slaves to Liberia. There were other African Americans that either were escaped slaves or had bought their freedom or were born free that were part of the abolitionist movement. A couple you learned about actually had their own newspaper. Okay, which brings us to today. You're going to continue your outline for Monday's work, and you're going to outline the rest of the section. The first person you're going to read about is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is a really interesting guy. He was born a slave in Maryland, and for some reason, his owner's wife actually taught him to read and write, which is very odd because it was against the law. And after a while, the husband said, no, you can't do that anymore. And so she stopped teaching him to read and write, but he was already literate. When he escaped, he joined the abolitionist movement, which makes sense because he despised slavery and wanted to get the slaves to be freed. But what was interesting about Frederick Douglass is he was a really good speaker, and he could read and he could write, and he was very literate. And people would flock to see him speak. They would put posters up all around town. He was living in Philadelphia at the time, and there were a lot of abolitionists there. And people would come, hundreds of them per night, to come and see him speak about his life. He actually opened his own newspaper, and he wrote an autobiography. And so those were really good tools for the abolitionist movement. The next person you're going to read about is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is interesting. She actually was a slave in New York, which most of us don't think about slavery in the northern states. But there was slavery in every state at the beginning of, after the American Revolution. And so she actually was a slave in New York, and she escaped, and she actually was a poet. She spoke out against slavery, and she also was a women's suffrage person. Her most famous piece of literature is called Ain't I a Woman? You can look it up if you want. You can find it on the internet. There are some really, really cool adaptations of famous people speaking. Her famous poem, Ain't I a Woman? If you get a chance, you can go look at that and listen to that. It's quite moving. And then I also want to talk about the Underground Railroad. First of all, the Underground Railroad is neither underground nor a railroad. What it really was a group of Southern people who own homes in the South, and they would be willing to help escape slaves. An escaped slave would run away, and other slaves would say, hey, this is the first safe house, go there. The slaves would run at night, and then they would sleep all day, because if they were caught during the day, it'd be easy to see who they were, and they'd put them back into slavery and do horrible things to them. So they would go to the first safe house. That first safe house would put them up. They would sleep during the day. They would give them food and water. And they'd say, okay, the next house is 3 miles down the road, and it has a pineapple in the front yard. They would knock on that door. The people would bring them in. They would either hide them in the basements or behind doors, make up fake walls in their homes. And the slave would continue doing this house to house until they made it up north. And they would follow the North Star, because that would mean you were going north. One of the most famous conductors, is what they called them, people who helped slaves escape through the Underground Railroad, was Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was a woman who was born into slavery. Her family members were sold off, and she eventually escaped and made it up north. What's so interesting about Harriet is that she came back time and time and time again. And she helped like 1,000 different people escape. If they would have caught Harriet Tubman, they would have hanged her immediately. she was one of the most hated people in the South because, first of all, she was successful in her flight to get away. And then she came back, the audacity for her to come back and help other people escape. She was not well liked. So you actually will get a chance to read more about her and Frederick Douglass later in the week. What was the reaction? Like I told you, up north, most people did not want slavery to end. In the South, it was worse than that. The Southerners believed that this was their right, it was a state's right, and this argument of that with the abolitionists is eventually going to move into the Civil War because we couldn't have half the country free and half the country free, half slave. That's about it, what you're going to be reading today. The rest of the week is going to be quite interesting. We don't have school on Friday, so you don't have to do any work on Friday. Tomorrow, you're going to read the next section, which is chapter 15, section 3. It's the last section of the chapter. And you're going to do Cornell notes. And then on Wednesday, you're going to actually do a biography. You're going to read a biography and watch a short video about Frederick Douglass. And you're going to do an actual quiz. I'll have it on Edsby. It'll be graded immediately as you finish it. Thursday, you're going to do the same thing, but it'll be about Harriet Tubman, and you're going to take a quiz. That's all your work for the week. So you really don't have a lot of writing this week. Same amount of work, it'll just be a different way. You'll take quizzes as opposed to writing this week for 2 of the days. Have a great week, and if you have any questions, you can Edsby message me. I am working on grading all of the submissions I received this weekend. I'm about halfway finished grading them, and they'll all be up by this afternoon. Have a great day, and see you tomorrow.